won the night he waited. He didn't leave because she pushed him away. He left because she didn't stop him. If stories about love, silence, and the things we never say feel familiar to you, subscribe to Hidden Angle Podcast before we go deeper. Some truths are easier to face when you're not alone. It was raining, the kind of quiet rain that makes everything feel suspended. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just still. Ethan stood by the door with his hand resting on the cold brass handle. Not gripping it, not turning it. Just waiting. Clara was across the room. Barefoot, arms folded loosely. Watching him the way you watch a train you're not sure you should board. He had already said what sounded like a goodbye. Soft, controlled. I think maybe we both need space. What he meant was, tell me not to go. There are moments in love that aren't loud. They don't shatter plates or slam doors. They hover in the air like breath on winter glass. Ethan counted 3 seconds. Then 5. Then 10. He thought she would cross the room. Thought she would say his name differently. Thought she would break first. Clara felt the tremor in her chest. Felt the instinct to reach. But instinct and fear often share the same voice. If he wants to stay, she told herself, he will. If I ask him, I might lose myself. So she stayed where she was. And that was the moment everything shifted. Not when he opened the door. Not when the rain touched his jacket. But when neither of them moved. Ethan finally turned the handle. The sound was small. Almost polite. He waited again, one last time. For her to say, stay. She didn't. And in that silence, he translated her stillness into rejection. What Clara didn't know was that he had been waiting his whole life for someone to choose him loudly. What Ethan didn't know was that she had survived by never begging anyone to stay. 2 children in adult bodies. Standing 5 feet apart. Both convinced love required dignity. The door closed. Not with violence. Not with drama. Just a soft click that sounded like something ending. And neither of them understood yet. That abandonment doesn't always look like someone walking away. Sometimes it looks like 2 people waiting for the other to move first. To the silence that echoed. He told himself he was being reasonable. That leaving was mature, clean, necessary. But the truth was simpler and uglier. Ethan didn't walk out because the relationship was broken. He walked out because the room stayed quiet. He drove with both hands locked on the wheel. Like if he loosened his grip, he might fall apart. The windshield wipers kept time with his thoughts, back and forth. Back and forth, erasing rain the way he wished he could erase the image of Clara standing there. Still as a photograph. He waited for his phone to light up. Not with a paragraph, not with a speech. Just one sentence. Come back. At the first red light, he checked the screen. Nothing. At the second, he checked again. Nothing. By the third, he hated himself for checking because it meant he needed her. And needing her felt like losing. He told himself she was proud. He told himself she was cold. He told himself she didn't care. And every story he invented hurt less than the one he didn't want to name. That maybe he wasn't the kind of man people fought to keep. Across the city, Clara stood in the same room long after the door clicked shut. The air felt wrong, like it had been rearranged. She didn't cry at first. She just listened. The fridge hummed. A car passed outside. A pipe somewhere in the building knocked softly like a distant heartbeat. She stared at the spot where Ethan had been. And a part of her waited for him to come back in, like this had all been a test of pride they could laugh about later. But minutes turned into an hour. Her phone sat face down on the table. Clara could have picked it up. She could have typed his name and sent something simple. Don't go. I miss you already. Please. But the word, please, tasted dangerous. Because once you say please, you admit you want. And once you admit you want, you give someone the power to leave anyway. So she stayed silent, telling herself she was being strong. That she was doing the dignified thing. That if Ethan loved her, he'd come back without being asked. What she didn't realize was that Ethan's wound didn't hear dignity. It heard distance. Ethan's silence became a courtroom, and Clara's quiet became evidence. He replayed the moment like a cruel loop, his hand on the door. Her unmoving body, the way she didn't reach, and each replay sharpened the same verdict. She chose her pride over you. She chose peace over you. She chose a life without you. Clara, meanwhile, replayed her own version, the way he said, space, the way he looked tired, the way his voice didn't tremble. She translated that steadiness into certainty. He already decided. He was ready to leave. If I begged, I'd only be proving I'm not enough. Two people, one moment. Two translations. Both tragic. And the next morning, the silence wasn't just a pause anymore. It had weight. It had memory. It had an echo that followed them into everything else, into work meetings, into grocery aisles, into the way Ethan flinched when a woman asked him what he wanted, into the way Clara smiled a little too politely when someone offered to help. Not because they stopped loving each other. Because the quiet taught them the wrong lesson. 3. What they never said. In the days after he left, Ethan kept telling himself he was fine. He answered emails faster. He went to the gym earlier. He smiled at people like nothing had changed. But grief doesn't always look like tears. Sometimes it looks like efficiency. At night, the quiet got personal. He'd reach for his phone without thinking, thumb hovering over Clara's name, then stop like the screen might burn him. Because calling her would mean admitting something he'd trained himself not to admit. I need you. Ethan's mother had walked out when he was 9. Not in a storm of shouting. Not in some dramatic scene. She packed a suitcase, kissed his forehead, said, "Be good for your dad." Then the door closed, and the house learned a new kind of silence. His father never spoke about it. Not once. No anger, no explanation. Just a tight jaw at dinner and a TV turned up too loud. Ethan learned the rule early. If you want someone, don't show it. If you're hurt, swallow it. If you're left, pretend you weren't. So when Clara didn't ask him to stay, it didn't feel like one moment. It felt like every moment he'd ever survived. Clara had her own history, quieter, but just as sharp. Her father wasn't the kind of man who left. He stayed. But he stayed like furniture stays. Present, useful, silent. He paid for piano lessons, fixed leaky faucets, showed up to graduations. And yet when Clara tried to tell him she was scared, or lonely, or proud, he'd respond with solutions instead of warmth. Work harder. Don't be so sensitive. You'll be fine. Love, in her house, wasn't spoken. It was managed. So Clara learned her rule. Never ask, never chase, never beg. Because needing someone was the fastest way to be disappointed. That's what Ethan never said to her, that his chest was full of old abandonment. And her silence landed on it like a final stamp of approval. Yes. You are easy to leave. And that's what Clara never said to him, that she was terrified of becoming the kind of woman who had to plead for attention. The kind who shrinks herself just to be chosen. They didn't talk about these things because they didn't have language for them. They only had habits. Ethan's habit was leaving before he could be left. Clara's habit was not reaching so she couldn't be rejected. And when two defenses collide, they look like pride. They sound like calm voices. They feel like distance. On the outside, they were two adults being mature. On the inside, they were two kids guarding their bruises. Ethan wanted to tell her, "Say my name like you mean it. Touch my arm and make me stay. Give me a reason to believe I matter." Clara wanted to tell him, "If you love me, don't test me. Don't make me beg for what you're already feeling. Choose me without punishment." But they never said it. Instead, Ethan posted a clean photo at a restaurant with coworkers. Clara replied to texts with "lol" and "sure." They performed normal. And the unspoken truth sat between them like a third person, quiet, patient, undefeated. Because what they never said wasn't small. It was the whole story. For the first lesson of leaving. The first lesson of leaving isn't the goodbye. It's what your body learns to expect afterward. For Ethan, leaving had always felt like survival. Not because he loved walking away, but because he loved the feeling of control it gave him. If he left first, he didn't have to watch someone else decide he wasn't worth staying for. He told himself that night with Clara was different. That he was older now, smarter, past the childhood stuff. But childhood doesn't disappear. It just waits for a familiar moment. When he was 9, Ethan had learned the sound of a suitcase rolling across hardwood floors. Soft wheels. A zipper. A pause at the doorway. His mother's perfume lingering in the hallway after she'd already stepped out. He remembered the way he stood too still, like if he moved, the whole house might collapse. He remembered wanting to say something, anything, that would make her turn around. But he didn't. Not because he didn't love her. Because he didn't know how to ask for love without feeling ashamed. So he watched her leave. And his brain did what it had to do to keep him functioning. It turned the moment into a rule. If you don't beg, it hurts less. If you act fine, you are safe. If you never need anyone, no one can abandon you. That rule grew up with him. It sat in the passenger seat on every date. It stood behind him in every argument. It whispered under every, "I'm good," he ever said. And when Clara didn't ask him to stay, the rule woke up. It didn't say, "She's scared." It didn't say, "She's protecting herself." It said one clean sentence that felt like truth. "You're not chosen." Clara's first lesson of leaving looked different, but it carved just as deep. She didn't grow up with someone walking out. She grew up with someone staying while emotionally gone. Her father never disappeared from the house. But he disappeared from the room. He'd come home, loosen his tie, sit at the table, and if Clara tried to tell him about her day, he'd nod without looking up. If she cried, he'd offer logic instead of arms. "Don't take it personally. You'll get over it. Be strong." So Clara learned her own rule. If you ask for comfort, you become a burden. If you show need, people pull away. If you stay quiet, you keep your dignity. Her silence wasn't cold, it was trained. And that's the cruel part, Ethan and Clara weren't reacting to each other. They were reacting to ghosts. Ethan saw Clara's stillness and felt the old ache of being left. Clara saw Ethan's exit and felt the old shame of having needs. So they did what their rules told them to do. He left to protect his pride. She stayed silent to protect her self-respect. Two protections that looked like cruelty. And somewhere underneath all of it, two hearts begging in languages they didn't know how to speak. Because the first lesson of leaving is never, "People go." The first lesson is how you explain it to yourself. Ethan explained it as rejection. Clara explained it as inevitability. And those explanations became the start of the next wound. 5 Emotional unavailability in disguise. From the outside, Ethan looked like the kind of man who knew how to love. He remembered her coffee order. He fixed the loose cabinet hinge without being asked. He sent a car when it rained too hard and she'd had a long day. He did love, efficiently. Like a checklist. Like proof. And Clara looked like the kind of woman who was easy to be with. She didn't demand constant texts. She didn't interrogate his silence. She didn't turn every distance into a fight. She loved, quietly. Like breathing. Like she could survive without being noticed. That's the trick of emotional unavailability. It rarely shows up as cruelty. Most of the time, it shows up as competence. Ethan gave her solutions when she needed softness. When Clara said, "I've been tired lately," he'd say, "Sleep more, take vitamins, I'll handle dinner." He didn't hear the part she didn't say. "Hold me, ask me what's wrong, stay here with me." Because if Ethan stayed too long inside someone's feelings, he risked feeling his own. And his feelings were messy, old, loud, dangerous, so he learned to keep love moving. Keep it practical, keep it safe. Clara did the opposite. She made herself smaller so no one would have to work to keep her. When Ethan came home late, she'd smile and say, "It's okay." When he forgot an anniversary dinner, She'd laugh it off and order takeout like it didn't matter. When he looked distant, she'd give him space, because that was what good women did. But inside, her heart was doing something else entirely. It was rehearsing how to lose him without breaking. They both called it maturity. Ethan called it, "I don't want drama." Clara called it, "I don't want to be needy." But what it really was fear wearing a clean outfit. There was a night, weeks before the door, when Clara tried, gently, to step closer. They were lying in bed, the room lit by streetlight through thin curtains. Ethan was scrolling on his phone. Half present, Clara turned toward him and said, softly, "Do you ever worry we're not really here?" Not accusing, not demanding. Just a question shaped like a hand reaching out. Ethan didn't look up. He said, "We're fine." 2 words. A wall. Clara felt that familiar drop in her stomach, the one she'd felt as a child. When she'd try to talk and adults would answer with facts instead of attention. She swallowed what she wanted to say next. "I miss you while you're still beside me." Instead, she said, "Yeah, sorry, forget it." And that was their pattern. When she reached, he minimized. When he minimized, she withdrew. When she withdrew, he assumed she didn't need much. And because he assumed she didn't need much, he offered even less. They weren't fighting, that was the problem. They were slowly disappearing from each other, politely. Ethan thought love meant providing. Clara thought love meant not asking for more than someone could give. So they both stayed good. Good at functioning. Good at keeping the mood light. Good at pretending the distance was normal. Until the distance started to feel like the relationship. And the cruelest part? If you asked Ethan, he would have said, "I'm doing everything I can." If you asked Clara, she would have said, "I'm trying not to be a burden." Both would be telling the truth. And both truths would still leave them lonely. Because emotional unavailability, when it's disguised as being easy and responsible, doesn't feel like rejection. It feels like 2 people being careful. Careful enough to never touch the real thing. 6. The misinterpretation. The misinterpretation didn't happen all at once. It happened in small edits. A look that meant "I'm scared" became "I don't care." A pause that meant "I'm trying not to beg" became "I'm glad you're leaving." 2 people took the same silence and wrote opposite stories on it. Ethan told himself he could handle it, that he'd made the clean decision. But the next day, when he walked into his office and someone asked, "Everything okay?" he heard himself say, "Yeah, just tired." Tired, that was his safest word. Because if he said the truth, "I feel unwanted," he would have to admit the deepest fear he carried like a bruise under the skin. That love is always conditional. That people stay until you ask for too much. That the moment you show need, you lose. So he became calm. Too calm. He answered texts with short sentences. He took meetings he didn't need. He smiled like a man who had moved on. But in private, he replayed the night over and over, hunting for proof that he mattered. He remembered how Clara's eyes softened. How her mouth almost opened. How her hands stayed folded instead of reaching for him. And his mind said, "See? She watched you go." He called his friend Marcus and tried to make it sound casual. "Yeah, we're taking space," he said, "no drama." Marcus paused. "Did she say she wanted you to go?" Ethan's throat tightened. "She didn't say anything." Marcus didn't answer right away. Then he said softly, "That's not the same thing, man." But Ethan couldn't hear that. Not yet, because the boy inside him didn't know how to translate silence into anything but rejection. Across town, Clara was living inside her own misinterpretation. People think the one who stays quiet is the stronger one. But silence isn't strength if it's built out of fear. Clara went to work, spoke to clients, laughed at the right moments, then came home to a room that felt too wide. She told herself she'd done the right thing. If Ethan wanted to stay, he would have stayed. If he loved me, he wouldn't leave me to guess. That logic felt clean, protective, mature. But at night, her body didn't believe it. She kept waking up at 2:13 a.m. like her nervous system had set an alarm for grief. She'd stare at the ceiling and think about all the ways she could have said one sentence without losing herself. Don't go. Wait. Can we try again? Then her chest would tighten, and she'd hear her father's voice from years ago, calm, dismissive, practical. Needing people makes you weak. So she swallowed the words. Again. And that's how the misinterpretation deepened. Each day they chose the story that hurt less in the moment, and cost more in the long run. Ethan interpreted Clara's stillness as indifference. Clara interpreted Ethan's leaving as certainty. Neither of those interpretations was true. But truth requires risk. Truth requires someone to say, "I'm scared," before the other person decides you don't care. They didn't risk it. So they built a whole future out of one wrong translation. A future where Ethan told himself, "She never chose me." A future where Clara told herself, "He never really wanted me." And the saddest part? If you placed them back in that room and gave them one honest sentence each, the story would change. Ethan would say, "I was waiting for you." Clara would say, "I didn't know how to ask." But they didn't say that. They said nothing. And silence, when you're wounded, always sounds like goodbye. 7 becoming smaller. After the breakup, nothing dramatic happened. No screaming. No public collapse. No, "I miss you" texts at midnight. Just 2 people slowly shrinking, in different directions. Ethan became smaller in the way men do when they're trying to prove they're fine. He filled his calendar until there was no room for feeling. Early flights, late dinners, back-to-back meetings that didn't matter. He started saying, "busy," like it was a personality. And when people asked about Clara, he kept his voice neutral. "She's good," he'd say. "We just wanted different things." Different things, another safe phrase. Because the truth was, he still wanted the same thing he'd always wanted, to be chosen without having to ask. He started dating again quickly, not because he'd moved on, but because empty space was dangerous. Empty space had echoes. Empty space asked questions. So he chose women who didn't ask him for much. Women who laughed easily. Women who said they were low maintenance. Women who praised his independence like it was maturity. And every time a woman said, "You're so easy to be with," Ethan felt relief and something colder underneath. Because easy meant he was safe. But it also meant he was not truly seen. He'd offer them the same kind of love he offered Clara, practical, helpful, present in actions, and they'd accept it, mostly, until one night, someone would say, softly, "Do you ever talk about what you feel?" Ethan would smile and answer like a gentleman, "I'm not really like that." And he'd watch their eyes change, just slightly, like a light dimming. Not anger, not even disappointment, just recognition. Then he'd pull back before they could. Because that was his oldest skill, leaving emotionally before anyone could leave him. Clara became smaller in a quieter way. She didn't throw herself into work the way Ethan did. She did something more subtle. She stopped taking up space in other people's hearts. She went on dates, too, but she chose men who were already halfway gone. Men with unread messages, men with complicated exes, men who kept things casual because it made the ending easier. When a man didn't reply for hours, she told herself, "It's fine." When he canceled plans last minute, she smiled, "No worries." When he forgot something she mentioned, she shrugged like it didn't matter. She trained herself to be easy. Not because she didn't want closeness, but because closeness had a price. Clara's body still remembered the night Ethan left. It remembered the shame of wanting to reach out, the fear that if she asked for love, she'd become too much. So she practiced being less emotional, less attached, less honest. And the cruel part is, people rewarded her for it. "You're so chill," they said. "You're not like other girls. You're so independent." They didn't realize they were complimenting her wound. Some nights, Clara would sit on her couch with a blanket over her knees, watching a show she wasn't following. Her phone would be in her hand, unlocked, her thumb hovering over Ethan's name like it used to. And she'd whisper to herself, like a prayer, Don't beg. Don't reopen it. Because once you reach, you admit you still want. And if you still want, you can still be abandoned. Ethan, on his side of the city, did the same thing, different words. Same fear. Don't text. Don't show need. Don't give her the power to confirm what you already believe. So they both became smaller. Not in height. Not in beauty. Not in success. Smaller in courage. They stopped asking for what they needed. They stopped risking the truth. They stopped letting love be loud. And in the space where love should have grown, a new habit formed. Survive first. Feel later. But later never came. Because when you keep shrinking to avoid pain, you eventually fit inside a life that can't hold you. 8. The armor. Armor doesn't always look like hardness. Sometimes it looks like success. Ethan's armor was polished, expensive, impressive, the kind people compliment without realizing they're praising a wound. He started arriving earlier than everyone else, leaving later than he needed to, filling every gap with performance. Promotions came, bigger titles, cleaner suits, a life that looked fine from 10 feet away. And when someone asked, "Are you happy?" he learned to answer with numbers. "I'm doing well. I'm busy. It's a good year." As if well-being could be measured like profit. At night, he'd stand in front of his bathroom mirror, collar loosened, eyes tired, and feel the strangest thing: the more he achieved, the less he could feel. Like emotion was a luxury he'd traded for control. He told himself it was adulthood. It was actually avoidance. Because if he stopped moving, he might hear Clara's silence again. So he kept moving. He worked through weekends. He said yes to dinners he didn't want. He laughed at jokes that weren't funny. He became the man people called strong. Because he never admitted he was bleeding. Clara built a different kind of armor. Not loud, not shiny. Quiet, seamless, invisible. Her armor was self-sufficiency. She became the woman who never needed anything, at least not in public. She upgraded her apartment, curated her life like a clean magazine spread. She learned how to host dinners with soft music and perfect lighting. Then sleep alone without making it look lonely. When friends tried to check in, she'd tilt her head and say, "I'm okay, honestly." And she meant it, because she had learned to define okay as not falling apart. She stopped posting about love, stopped admitting she missed anyone, stopped letting her voice crack when she talked about the future. She turned her longing into taste, new books, new candles, new routines. People called her healed. But healing isn't just looking calm. Sometimes calm is dissociation in a pretty dress. The armor worked until it didn't. Because one day, something small broke through. Ethan was in an elevator. Alone, going up 40 floors. A woman's perfume lingered from the previous ride, warm and familiar, and for a second his throat tightened. It wasn't the perfume itself. It was the memory attached to it, Clara's hair against his chest. The way she'd exhale when she finally relaxed. He swallowed hard and stared at the floor numbers like they could save him. 36, 37, 38. He thought, absurdly, if I don't feel it, it won't be real. Across town, Clara was in a grocery store, reaching for a jar of honey. She heard a man behind her laugh softly, low, controlled, and her hands froze. Not because the laugh sounded like Ethan exactly, but because it carried the same shape of restraint. For a moment, her body forgot the rules. Her eyes stung. Her chest warmed. Her mouth opened like she might say his name. Then she remembered where she was. Who she was supposed to be now, the composed woman, the independent one, and she swallowed it back down like a secret. That's how armor keeps you alive. And that's how it keeps you lonely. Ethan's armor made him desirable, admired, untouchable. It protected him from rejection, but it also protected him from intimacy. He could be surrounded by people and still feel like no one had access to him. Clara's armor made her graceful, stable, easy. It protected her from needing anyone, but it also made her unreachable, like she lived behind glass. And the worst part was, they both mistook the armor for identity. Ethan thought, I'm just not emotional. Clara thought, I'm just independent. But underneath, their bodies were still the same two people from that night, two hearts holding their breath, waiting for permission to be soft. Armor is useful until you forget how to take it off. And love can't reach you if you never come out. 9. The quiet ache. The ache didn't scream. It didn't demand attention. It just stayed. Ethan thought time would blunt it. That distance would sand down the sharp edges of Clara's absence until it felt like memory instead of loss. But grief has a way of hiding in ordinary moments. One afternoon, he was walking past a bookstore when he saw a copy of the novel Clara once read out loud to him on a lazy Sunday. He almost kept walking, almost. Instead, he stopped. Not because of the book. Because of the way she used to tuck her feet under his thigh when she read. The way she'd pause mid-sentence and ask, "Are you even listening?" even though she knew he was. He stood there longer than necessary. People brushed past him, the world kept moving. Inside, something pressed gently against his ribs. Not dramatic, not overwhelming. Just present. That night, he poured himself a drink he didn't really want. Sat on his couch, scrolled through his phone without absorbing anything. He paused over her old contact photo, still there, unchanged. He didn't delete it. Not because he hoped she'd call. Because deleting it would make it final. And he wasn't ready for final. Across town, Clara felt it too, but differently. Her ache came in waves of quiet comparison. A man would reach for her hand across a dinner table, and she'd notice the difference. Not in strength, not in warmth. In familiarity. Ethan used to squeeze her fingers twice when he was nervous. No one else did that. She'd tell herself it didn't matter. She'd tell herself love wasn't about small details. But it is. It always is. Some nights, she'd lie in bed and replay conversations she never had. Not arguments, not dramatic confessions. Simple sentences. Did you mean it? Were you already leaving? Would you have stayed if I asked? She imagined different answers, different endings, versions of herself braver, softer, louder. And every imagined version hurt. Because the real one had stayed silent. The ache was quiet because it didn't accuse. It didn't say, "You were wrong." It said, "You were scared." And that's harder to face. Ethan started noticing how often Clara still lived in his reactions. When a woman asked too many questions, he withdrew faster. When someone didn't ask enough, he felt that old irritation rise again. He wasn't reacting to them. He was reacting to her. To the night she didn't speak. Clara did the same thing in reverse. If a man expressed strong feelings too quickly, she felt cornered. If he expressed nothing at all, she felt invisible. She kept thinking she'd find someone who balanced it perfectly. But what she was really searching for was a rewrite. A version of that night where neither of them mistook fear for indifference. The ache never knocked loudly. It showed up in grocery stores, in elevator rides, in songs that weren't even about love, in the way Ethan still glanced at women with Clara's hair color. Just for a second too long. In the way Clara paused whenever she passed the street where his old apartment stood. They were functioning. They were dating. They were surviving. But somewhere beneath the schedules and the curated independence, something tender refused to disappear. Not because they were meant to be together, but because they never truly understood what happened. The quiet ache wasn't longing for the relationship. It was longing for clarity. For the moment to be rewritten. For one honest sentence spoken at the right time. And until that sentence existed, even only inside themselves, the ache stayed. Soft. Persistent. Like a bruise you stop noticing until someone touches it. 10. The relationships that felt safe. Safe relationships are the ones that don't ask you to grow. They feel smooth, predictable, clean. And after Clara, that's exactly what Ethan went looking for. He dated women who liked him the way he presented himself, quiet competence. Controlled charm, a man who never made things heavy. They'd call him steady, mature, a catch. And he'd accept the compliments like receipts. See, he'd tell himself, "You're fine." But fine isn't intimacy. It's a ceiling. One woman, Alyssa, fit perfectly into his life. She laughed at his jokes, didn't question his long hours, and always said, "I get it, you're busy." She never asked about his childhood, never asked about Clara, never asked what he felt when a room got too quiet. Ethan liked that. He told himself it was peace. But peace without truth is just numbness with good manners. On their third month together, Alyssa leaned against his kitchen counter while he cooked. She watched him move, precise, efficient, in control, and she smiled like she'd won something. "You're easy," she said. "You don't need much." Ethan smiled back, but his chest tightened. Because a part of him heard what she didn't mean. "I don't have to go deep with you." Later that night, she reached for him in bed, warm and familiar in a way that should have been comforting. Ethan kissed her, held her, did everything right, yet inside, he felt like he was watching himself from a distance. Like he was acting in a scene called normal. And when Alyssa whispered, "I really like you," Ethan whispered back, "Me too." He didn't say the other sentence sitting behind his teeth. "I don't know how to let you in." Clara built her safe relationships differently. She chose men who were kind but contained. Men who didn't stare too long into her eyes. Men who liked her independence. Who praised her calm. Who never demanded more than she could offer. One of them, Noah, was gentle in a way that never threatened her. He asked about her day, remembered her favorite tea, sent goodnight texts that felt like polite little check-ins. Clara loved how safe it felt. No pressure. No pleading. No risk. But safety started to resemble distance. Noah would say, "I'm here if you need anything." And Clara would smile, "I'm okay," even when she wasn't, because needing anything still felt like a trapdoor. One evening, Noah reached across the table and said, softly, "I feel like you're always half a step away." Clara laughed lightly, like he'd just described her posture. "I'm just tired," she said. Tired, her safest word too. Noah nodded, but his eyes held something she didn't want to touch. Concern has weight. And weight feels like expectation. So Clara kept the relationship easy, pleasant, manageable. She thought that was what healing looked like. But healing has warmth. What she was building was a life with the temperature turned down. Ethan and Clara weren't choosing bad people. They were choosing people who wouldn't activate their deepest fear. Ethan chose women who didn't ask him to feel, so he wouldn't have to risk being seen and left. Clara chose men who didn't ask her to need, so she wouldn't have to risk asking and being refused. And for a while, it worked. They went to dinners. They posted photos. They smiled in the right places. But the quiet ache didn't leave. Because safety isn't the same as closeness. Safety is a room with the windows closed. Nothing gets in. Nothing hurts you. But nothing touches you either. And eventually, you start to miss the air. Ethan would lie beside Alyssa and feel guilty for feeling distant. Guilty for not being grateful. Clara would sit across from Noah and feel guilty for wanting more. Guilty for even thinking the word, more. They kept telling themselves, this is better. No drama. No abandonment. No heartbreak. Just one problem. They were still lonely. Not the lonely of being alone. The lonely of being untouchable. 11 the night they met again. It wasn't planned. That's how these things happen, like the universe doesn't announce itself. It just bumps into you in a hallway. Ethan was leaving a gallery opening he didn't care about. He'd shown up because someone told him it would be good networking, and he'd smiled at strangers. Held a glass he didn't want. And said the right words with the right amount of charm. He was halfway to the exit when he heard her laugh. Not loud, not performative. Just real. His body reacted before his mind did. A quiet tightening in his chest. A small heat behind his eyes. The kind of reaction that proves you were never as over it as you pretended. He turned. And there she was. Clara stood near a white wall covered in abstract paintings. Her hair longer than he remembered. Her face calmer, like she'd learned how to carry sadness without dropping it. She wore a simple black dress, nothing dramatic, yet somehow it looked like the room had been built around her. She was talking to someone. smiling politely. And Ethan hated how normal she looked. Because normal meant she hadn't collapsed after he left. Normal meant she didn't miss him the way he missed her. Normal meant the story he'd been living, "I mattered and she let me go," might not be true. Clara noticed him at the same moment. Her smile froze for half a second, then returned, smooth, practiced. It took everything in her not to turn away. Because the last time she saw him, she'd swallowed her voice. And her body remembered the taste of that. Ethan walked toward her slowly, like he wasn't sure the floor would hold. He could feel the room moving around them. People laughing, glasses clinking, music humming in the background, yet the air between them felt private. Like a curtain had dropped. "Clara," he said. Her name left his mouth like a confession. "Ethan," she answered. 2 words, and suddenly they were back in that apartment. Back at the door, back inside all the things they never finished. They stood there, close enough to touch, still too far to admit they wanted to. Clara cleared her throat. "Hi." Ethan nodded. "Hi." And then, nothing. Not because they had nothing to say. Because they had too much. He wanted to ask, "Why didn't you stop me?" She wanted to ask, "Why didn't you stay?" But those questions were sharp. Dangerous. So they did what emotionally careful people do. They stayed on the surface. "How have you been?" Ethan asked, voice steady. "I've been good," Clara said. "Busy." Busy, the word people use to avoid truth. Ethan smiled like it didn't hit him. "Yeah, same." A pause. Clara glanced at the painting beside them, pretending to study it. "You still work too much?" He let out a quiet breath. "Probably." She almost smiled, almost, like a memory tried to become a moment. Ethan looked at her hands, no ring. He shouldn't have checked. The fact that he did made him angry at himself. He noticed the small scar near her thumb. He remembered kissing that spot once, absent-mindedly, while she talked. And the ache returned, soft. Immediate. Clara noticed his shoulders. They looked heavier, not older, just more guarded. She wondered if anyone had touched him gently since her. She hated herself for wondering. A man beside Clara leaned in, saying her name, introducing himself to Ethan. Clarice, safe, relationship. Kind eyes, easy smile, no threat. Ethan felt something sting. Jealousy wasn't the worst feeling. The worst feeling was the realization that someone else had access to the life he used to share. He nodded politely, played the role, said the right thing. Then he looked back at Clara and found her watching him carefully. Like she was studying how close she could stand without falling in. "Are you happy?" he asked before he could stop himself. Clara blinked. The room seemed to quiet for a second. Her answer should have been simple. But happiness, for her, had become a performance. "I'm okay," she said finally. "Okay," another safe word. Ethan held her gaze, and for the first time, his voice cracked, just a little. "I'm not," he admitted. The confession was small, quiet, unpolished. Clara's throat tightened. She wanted to say, "Me neither." She wanted to say, "I was waiting too." She wanted to say everything. But her armor lifted its head. So instead, she whispered, "I'm glad you're doing well." He almost laughed, because it was such a perfect lie. And they both heard it. They stood in the middle of a crowded room, speaking in polite sentences, while their bodies screamed old truths. Then someone called Ethan's name from across the gallery. He stepped back, just slightly. And Clara felt the old panic rise, because stepping back was how leaving began. Ethan saw it in her eyes. For a second, he thought, say it. Ask her, tell her. But he didn't. Not yet. Because some wounds don't reopen with a scream. They reopen with a smile. 12 The question they avoided. They didn't talk again for a week. Not because they didn't want to. Because wanting felt dangerous. Ethan drafted messages and erased them. Clara stared at her screen until it dimmed. Then told herself she was being mature. They both called it, giving space. The way people do when they're trying to look calm while their nervous system is on fire. Then, on a quiet Thursday, Ethan texted first. Coffee? Just to catch up. The words were casual, padded with safety. Clara read it 3 times before answering. Sure. One word, no emoji, no softness, a clean reply that kept her heart behind glass. They met at a small cafe that smelled like cinnamon and burnt espresso. Neutral territory, public, safe, the kind of place where you can pretend you're not about to reopen a wound. Ethan arrived early, chose a table by the window, and watched the door like it might deliver forgiveness. When Clara walked in, he stood too fast. His chair scraped the floor. He hated that it betrayed him. She looked the same and different at once, like time had edited her around the edges. She sat, placed her bag carefully on the chair beside her, and smiled with the kind of politeness you use for someone important and far away. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he answered. Their voices sounded normal. Their bodies didn't. Ethan asked about her work. She answered in neat sentences. Clara asked about his job. He spoke in numbers and deadlines. They took sips at the same time, laughed at the same small jokes, 2 professionals performing fine. And the question sat between them like a third cup on the table. Unordered, untouched. Ethan kept circling it. He wanted to say, "Why didn't you stop me?" But he could already hear how it would sound, accusatory. Needy, like a man asking a woman to do the emotional labor of choosing him. So he tried a softer version. "That night," he began, voice low, "I didn't know what you wanted." Clara's fingers tightened around her cup. She kept her face calm. "I didn't either," she said. A half-truth. She had known what she wanted. She just didn't know how to ask for it without losing herself. Ethan nodded like he understood. He didn't, not fully. His chest was still carrying the old rule, if you weren't asked to stay, you weren't wanted. So he changed the topic again. Safer ground. "Are you seeing someone?" Clara's stomach dipped. She smiled anyway. "Yeah," she said quietly, "kind of." Ethan's jaw tightened in a way he couldn't control. He made a polite sound, like he was happy for her. Then he stared at the sugar packets as if they were suddenly fascinating. Clara watched him shrink into that calm mask again, the one that looks mature, but feels like abandonment, and something inside her snapped, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to make her honest for half a second. "Ethan," she said, softer, "you left." The sentence landed on the table like a coin. Simple, heavy. Ethan looked up. "I know," he said, "I did." He waited for her to keep going. She didn't. Because the real sentence was still trapped behind her teeth. "And I wanted you to stay." Instead, she reached for logic. I didn't think it was my place to stop you." There it was. The sentence that sounded like dignity and felt like fear. Ethan heard it as permission. As confirmation. As proof that he'd been right all along. "If it wasn't your place," he thought, "then I never belonged." His voice turned careful. "So you were okay with it?" Clara flinched. "That's not what I..." She stopped. Because explaining would require vulnerability. And vulnerability still felt like begging. Ethan leaned back, the old wound rising like a reflex. He wanted to punish her with distance the way distance had punished him. He almost said it. The question they'd been avoiding. "Why didn't you ask me to stay?" But asking it meant admitting he'd waited. That he'd needed her voice. That he'd made her silence responsible for his choice. And Clara almost asked hers too. "Why didn't you choose to stay?" But asking it meant admitting she had wanted him enough to risk losing dignity. So they both swallowed their questions. They paid for coffee. They stood outside under the gray sky. They talked about weather, about traffic, about how the city had changed. Normal. Polite. Careful. Then Clara said, "I should go." Ethan nodded. "Yeah, of course." He watched her walk away. And what hurt wasn't that she left. It was that they were both still standing in the same place they'd been years ago. 2 people protecting themselves from the exact words that could have saved them. 13. The confession. It happened on accident. Not in a grand speech. Not in a perfectly timed cinematic moment. Just a crack. A week after the cafe. Ethan texted Clara again. Can we talk? Really talk? No pretending. She stared at the message for a long time. Her first instinct was to protect herself. Protection had become muscle memory. But something inside her was tired. Tired of being composed. Tired of being correct. Tired of surviving her own pride. So she said yes. They met at his apartment this time. Not neutral ground, not public, no audience to perform for. Just a quiet room and two people who were running out of excuses. For a while, they stood across from each other like strangers rehearsing familiarity. Then Ethan spoke first. I didn't leave because I wanted to, he said. His voice wasn't polished. It wasn't calm in that practiced way. It shook just slightly, enough to be real. I left because I thought you didn't care. Clara inhaled sharply, like someone had pressed on a bruise she didn't know was still there. I cared, she said. He nodded, but didn't let her retreat into simplicity. Then why didn't you say anything? There it was, the question without armor. Clara's eyes filled, not dramatically, just enough to blur the edges of the room. Because if I asked you to stay, she said slowly, and you still left, I don't think I would have survived that. The room went quiet. Not tense, not hostile. Just honest. Ethan looked at her like he was seeing a new language for the first time. I wasn't testing you, he said, I was waiting. The word landed between them. Waiting. Clara's lips trembled. For what? For you to choose me, he answered. Not loudly, not angrily. Just plainly. Clara stepped back like the truth had physical weight. I thought if you loved me, she whispered, you would choose to stay without being asked. Ethan let out a breath that sounded like years. I didn't know how to do that, he admitted. Every time I felt like I wanted you more than you wanted me. I panicked. Clara closed her eyes. That night, she said, I wanted you to stay. I just didn't know how to say it without feeling small. And I didn't know how to stay without feeling unwanted, he replied. There it was. 2 sentences. 2 confessions. 2 children finally speaking inside adult bodies. Ethan ran a hand through his hair. A nervous habit Clara recognized instantly. I thought your silence meant I didn't matter. Clara shook her head gently. My silence meant I was scared. He looked at her for a long time. And something shifted, not magically. Not perfectly, but enough. Why didn't we just say that? He asked. Clara gave a soft, almost broken laugh. Because we both thought the other one was stronger. They stood there, closer now, not touching, but no longer guarded. Ethan swallowed. I didn't want to need you, he said quietly. Needing someone always ended badly for me. Clara nodded. I didn't want to beg, she said. Begging always felt humiliating. They weren't accusing each other anymore. They were explaining themselves. And that's different. Ethan stepped closer, careful, like approaching something fragile. I didn't leave because I didn't love you, he said. I left because I was afraid you didn't. Clara's tears fell now, steady and unhidden. I didn't ask you to stay because I was afraid you'd say no. Silence again. But this time, it wasn't a wall. It was space. Space where the truth had finally been placed between them, unprotected. Imperfect, alive. For the first time, neither of them felt small. They felt seen. 14 Abandonment has 2 faces. After the confession, the room didn't become lighter. It became real. Because once you name the wound, you have to see how deep it goes. Clara sat on Ethan's couch, knees tucked under her, fingers wrapped around a mug she wasn't drinking. Ethan sat across from her, elbows on his thighs, staring at the floor like it might offer a manual for what to do next. They weren't fighting. They were unraveling. I always thought abandonment was someone leaving, Ethan said quietly, like walking out, disappearing, choosing another life. Clara's voice was softer. Sometimes it is. He swallowed. But I think I've been abandoned by people who stayed. That sentence landed differently. Clara didn't interrupt. She just listened. Ethan looked up, eyes tired. My mom left when I was 9. But my dad, he stayed. And he never talked about it. He never asked me if I missed her. He never told me it wasn't my fault. His jaw tightened. He provided. He showed up. He paid the bills. But emotionally, he was gone. Clara felt something shift in her chest, recognition. That's what it was like for me too, she whispered, almost surprised by her own honesty. Not the leaving part, the staying part. Ethan frowned gently. Your dad? She nodded. He was there, always, but he didn't know how to hold feelings. He held responsibilities. Her eyes stared past Ethan, seeing a different room. Years ago, when I cried, he'd tell me what to do. When I was scared, he'd tell me to toughen up. He loved me, but it never felt like I was allowed to need him. Ethan's voice dropped. So you learned to be low maintenance. Clara let out a breath that sounded like truth. I learned to be invisible, she said. The silence after that wasn't awkward. It was heavy with meaning. Ethan leaned back, as if the pattern was finally showing itself clearly. So abandonment has two faces. He held up a hand. One is leaving, the other is being present without being reachable. Clara nodded slowly, and both teach the same lesson. Ethan asked, which one hurt you more? Clara didn't answer right away. She looked at her hands. The way people do when they're about to say something they've hidden for years. Being left hurts, she said, but being ignored while someone is right there, it makes you doubt your own needs. Her voice trembled. It makes you feel embarrassing for wanting comfort. Ethan's eyes softened. He understood that. Because his version was different. But the shame was the same. When you didn't ask me to stay, he said, I didn't just feel rejected. I felt exposed. He pressed a palm to his chest like he was trying to hold the feeling in. Like I'd been waiting my whole life for someone to choose me. And your silence confirmed what I already feared. Clara's throat tightened. And when you left, she said, I didn't just feel abandoned. I felt relieved. Ethan blinked. Clara hurried, afraid of being misunderstood. Not relieved you were gone, she whispered, relieved that I didn't have to risk begging. Her eyes filled, because begging would have meant admitting I needed you, and needing you felt like handing you a weapon. Ethan exhaled slowly. They were both seeing it now. The way they protected themselves had been the very thing that hurt them. Ethan protected himself by leaving first. Clara protected herself by not reaching first. Two defenses. Same wound. He said, so when I walked out, that was abandonment. Clara nodded. And when you stayed silent, he added, that was abandonment too. Clara's lips parted, then closed. She didn't argue, because she finally understood what he meant. Not that she had wanted him gone, but that her fear had made him feel alone in the room. Ethan's voice broke slightly. I think I've spent my whole life trying to outrun the version of abandonment that looks like quiet. Clara's voice was barely a whisper. Me too. They sat there, two adults, naming childhood in the present tense. And for the first time, abandonment didn't feel like a sentence. It felt like a map. A map that finally explained why love had felt so hard, even when it was real. 15. The choice they never had. The choice they never had wasn't stay or leave. It was something quieter. It was the choice to feel safe while staying. Ethan stared at his hands like they belonged to someone else. I keep thinking about that night, he said, voice low, like there was a right move. Like if I'd stayed, everything would have been different. Clara's eyes softened. Would it? He looked up. I don't know. And that was the truth. Because the version of Ethan who walked out wasn't just a man in pain. He was a man trained to survive. When you grow up learning that love can disappear without warning, you don't get a clean choice. You get a nervous system that chooses for you. You get instincts that say, leave before you're left. Ethan rubbed his thumb against his palm. A small self-soothing motion he didn't even notice. I didn't know how to stay in a room where I felt unwanted. He admitted, it felt like dying slowly. Clara swallowed hard. And I didn't know how to speak in a room where I felt like my needs were dangerous. They looked at each other then, not as enemies, not as exes, but as two people realizing they'd been fighting the same war from different sides. The choice we never had, Clara whispered, was to believe it was safe to be honest. Ethan exhaled. Yeah. Because honesty isn't just words. Honesty is risk. And neither of them had learned risk without punishment. Ethan had learned, if you need someone, they will leave. Clara had learned, if you need someone, they will shame you. So when love asked them to step forward, their bodies stepped back. They weren't choosing against each other. They were choosing against old pain. Clara's voice trembled. I used to think I was strong because I didn't ask. Because I didn't chase. Ethan nodded slowly. And I used to think I was strong because I didn't wait. Because I didn't look desperate. A sad, small laugh escaped her. We were both just terrified. He didn't deny it. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. If I'm honest, he said, that night I wanted you to say, don't go, not because I needed permission to stay, but because I needed proof I mattered. Clara's throat tightened, and I wanted you to say, I'm staying, not because I wanted control, but because I wanted to feel chosen without having to beg. They sat with that. Two wants that were never spoken. Two needs that were never allowed. Ethan's eyes flickered, as if he was watching the past change shape. So even if we had stayed together, he murmured, we would have kept bleeding in quieter ways. Clara nodded, because we didn't have the tools. We only had reflexes. Reflexes that looked like pride. Reflexes that looked like independence. Reflexes that looked like maturity. But underneath, fear. The choice they never had, Ethan repeated, almost to himself, was the choice to stay without armor. Clara's fingers tightened around her mug, and to leave without punishment. They both understood that, too. Because leaving doesn't have to be abandonment. Sometimes leaving is protection. Sometimes leaving is timing. Sometimes leaving is two people who love each other but don't yet know how to hold love without hurting. Clara looked at him carefully. Do you think we ever had a chance? Ethan didn't answer quickly. Then he said, softly, not the way we were. Not because the love wasn't real. But because love needs a safe place to land. And neither of them knew how to build that yet. He added, almost in a whisper, we didn't fail because we didn't try. We failed because we were trying with the wrong muscles. Clara's eyes filled. She understood. They had been trying to choose each other with bodies trained for survival. And survival always chooses safety over intimacy. That's the choice they never had. Not because they were weak. Because no one taught them how to feel safe while being seen. 16. If love comes back. If love comes back, it won't knock the same way. It won't arrive as fireworks. It won't beg to be noticed. It will come quietly, like recognition. Ethan stood by the window that night, the city lights flickering below, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was waiting to be chosen. He felt present. Clara stood a few steps behind him, not touching, not reaching, just breathing in the same room without armor. They had said the things they were too afraid to say before. They had named the wound instead of blaming the scar. And something shifted. Not the past. Not the pain. But the posture. Maybe love isn't about never leaving, Clara said softly. Ethan turned toward her. Maybe it's about staying when it's uncomfortable. She stepped closer this time, not because she was afraid he would leave, but because she wanted to. And that difference mattered. If love comes back, Ethan said, voice low, I don't want it to be built on fear. Clara nodded. I don't want it to be built on pride. They stood there, not promising forever, not rewriting history. Just choosing honesty over silence. Because love doesn't always fail when people walk away. Sometimes it fails when they don't know how to stay without shrinking. And if love returns, it returns asking a different question. Not, will you leave? But, can you stay without armor? Ethan reached for Clara's hand. Slowly this time, not as a test, not as a demand. As an offering. Clara let her fingers rest in his. Not because she was desperate. Not because she was afraid. But because she felt safe enough to be seen. And maybe that's what love looks like the second time around. Not louder. Just braver. If you've ever lost someone because neither of you knew how to speak first, If you've ever stayed silent because you were afraid of needing too much. If you've ever walked away while hoping someone would call you back. Then you understand. Abandonment has two faces. But so does healing. One face is awareness. The other is choice. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is unlearn survival and relearn softness. If this story touched something in you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below. What would you say now, if love came back? Like this video if it reminded you that vulnerability is strength. And subscribe to Hidden Angle Podcast for more stories about the quiet truths we're all learning to face. Because sometimes, the love you're waiting for is waiting for the version of you who feels safe enough to stay.